Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. Okay. Last week, we talked about appraisal contingency. We talked about changing the amount based on the offer price. We talked about the requirement of delivering the appraisal to the seller if it's FHA or VA. If it's conventional, that appraisal is only required to be delivered to the seller if a property doesn't appraise or the listing agent has requested it as part of their counter. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're working with a buyer. If it's FHA or VA, you've got to be prepared to give that appraisal over. Okay, if it's conventional, only if it doesn't appraise or if the seller has requested it. And those things have to be delivered even if the transaction doesn't close. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now that you can hear me. And we're going to talk about the rest of the contingencies here in 3L. So 3L is where all the buyer's contingencies are. This is what we're going to go through today. Remember, if you guys have a question or need to get my attention, raise your hand or type it in the chat. We already have a question in the chat. Does the seller have to request or do we have to provide once available? Well, again, if it's FHA or VA, the buyer is supposed to provide it. If the buyer doesn't, then just make that request. Just let the buyer's agent know, hey, contractually, you guys have to give it to me. If they don't, then you could send them a notice of perform. And if they still refuse to, then you'd have the option to cancel on them. Okay. If the property doesn't appraise and they're asking to change the price, then yeah, part of that negotiation with changing the price is you need to send me a copy of the appraisal. And if I've countered it and I ask them to send me the copy of the appraisal when they remove the appraisal contingency, or if I just say buyer will provide a copy of completed appraisal to seller, if they don't supply it to me, then essentially I could provide them with a notice to perform, and if they don't provide it, I could cancel. Okay. But yeah, so there may be requests that need to be made to get it, but the buyer's agent, as you guys, and that's what I'm trying to help with everybody that's seeing this or watching the videos later, is that you guys are doing the things that you're supposed to do, or you're prepared for doing that, and you understand it when you're on the flip side as a listing agent. Okay. So investigation of property, that's our next contingency. That is your total investigation. Everything that you need to do in order to find out if the condition of the property is acceptable to you to continue with the transaction, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer. Okay, that's everything. So that includes the professional home inspection, and that's kind of where we usually just kind of leave it at that as agents. Is like our focus is, this is your professional home inspection. But there could be other things that need to be investigated, and the buyer has the right to do any investigation they want on the property as long as it doesn't cause damage to the property or it doesn't cause a government inspection when there isn't one required by law. So if a seller were, for example, or buyer were, for example, to go to the city and say, hey, I'm buying this house and they have an illegal unit in the back, or they have an illegal covered patio, or whatever it is, and the city comes out then and says, hey, you got to tear this down, and they came out as a cause of the buyer could be held responsible for that. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. So make sure you're educating your buyers before they go talk to the city about anything. If they want to go to do as part of their investigation of the property to look at permits for the property, they have the right to do that. But the right way to do that is to go to the city and say, I need to see the permits, all the permits for this address. Don't ask for a specific permit for something. Don't ask, just say, I need to see all the permits for this address. And then that way you could look at what is permitted. And if there's something on there that is not permitted, that you don't see a permit for, that you were concerned about, then you can bring that up with the seller, but not with the city. And that's why it's really important. And we talk about this during the investigation period, is that you guys shouldn't be the one, the agent shouldn't be the one going to the city and pulling the permits. Because the people that work at the city are humans just like you guys are. And if they make a mistake and don't pull all the permits and give it to you, and then you go back and say, well, this isn't permitted or this is permitted, and then maybe it wasn't a final and you missed it, and it turns out that something you told them was permitted wasn't, right, because of the conversation, or something that was legal or wasn't, if you're the one who had the conversation, you could be held responsible, right? The example I used when I was muted, when my microphone wasn't working, was people like to buy properties, like, for example, a single family, and that is zoned an R2. And they think, oh, it's an R2 or an R3. I can turn this into a duplex or a triplex. Forget about ADUs. We're talking about converting to a duplex or triplex. And they want to do that because obviously that would add value to a property, the difference between a single family and a duplex or triplex, right? So they they find a property that's zoned R3. They think, okay, I want to buy it. I want to go and convert this. Instead of the buyer themselves going to the city to ask the question, the agent goes and says, hey, this is the property my clients are buying. It's zoned R2. Could we turn this single family into a duplex? If the city makes a mistake and tells you yes, and you go back and tell your buyers, yes, I went to the city and yes, you can turn this into a duplex, and then you close escrow and they can't because that guy was wrong or the person you talked to at the city was wrong, your buyers in return and said, you told me, you said I could build this into a duplex. Okay. Let's see. If the buyer asks me if I can do it, what do I tell them? I can't. In a nice, how do I tell them I can't do it in a nice way? You tell them just that. Hey, I can totally understand that you would like for me to do that. The compromise we can make is I will go with you, but you need to have the conversation with the people at the city. The reason is that if the city makes a mistake and they're speaking to you, then you were there, you heard it. Or if there could be miscommunication if I'm translating a conversation that I had with the city to you. So if we're going to do that, if you're concerned about that, I need you to go to the city and I will escort you there. I'll take you there and you have the conversation, but I can't be the one to do that because I don't want there to be any miscommunication between the city and you on what you can or can't do with the property. Okay. You got to make it more about how you're protecting them than how you're protecting yourself, even though the way we're, kind of appreciating it is approaching it is that you don't want to take on that liability. And so we work as a witness, not necessarily a witness. You're just kind of there to guide them to ask the right questions. So they're hearing it directly from the source, right? They're not hearing it from you. That's really what you want. You want them to get it from the source, not you. That's where what we're doing is we're kind of shifting that liability away from us. Okay. All right. So investigation of property. It's 17 days by default. Remember, if I'm the one who in initiating the offer is shortening my escrow period, I should be the one who's also shortening that period too. It amazes me how many times I see offers where someone will bring it to me and say, hey, I'm submitting this offer. Can you review it? And they've changed it from a 21-day, 30 or 45-day escrow to a 21-day escrow. Or even I've had agents that show me buyers that are going to buy cash where it's a 17-day escrow or 14-day escrow, and their contingencies are still in place at 17 days. It has to have some logic behind it, because think about how that looks to a listing agent when I receive it. Well, you're asking for a 14-day escrow, but basically you have contingencies throughout the whole thing. Make it make sense. Let's look at it and be logical and professional and say, okay, if I have a 14-day escrow, well, then this investigation of property is probably going to have to look something like 7 days or 5 days. And the thing, as opposed to an appraisal where we're looking at the days because it's out of our hands, right? The lender is ordering the appraisal and there's steps that have to happen before the appraisal can go out. That needs a longer period of time. But investigation of property, if all it is me going to check the property, make sure the condition's okay, and I'm hiring a professional home inspector to go out, if I get my offer accepted today, I could have a home inspector out there tomorrow, Saturday at the latest. You can have it happen quickly. Okay. And speaking of that, just a bit of advice for you guys. When it comes to the home inspectors, you guys shouldn't be hiring them. You, the agent, should not be the one hiring the home inspector. Again, if the home inspector makes a mistake and you were the one who hired, you went and found him, made the appointment, and all the buyer did was pay, the buyer could then come back and say, if the inspector makes a mistake, you were the one who hired them. I didn't pick them. Okay. So when it comes to the home inspection, and yes, you can do it quickly. You just have to make sure your buyers are on board. Here, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, here are 3 home inspection companies. I worked with all of them. I think they're all fantastic. Hire anyone you want or Google one and hire them. Just let me know when you're setting the appointment or when you can set the appointment so that I can make sure that we have it arranged with the listing agent. That's it. Let them pick the home inspection company. Should always do that with those services, because if I'm the one who chose them, scheduled the appointment, and all my buyer did was pay, and there's a problem with them, I'm going to be held liable for that. Okay. So you got to also protect yourselves when we're trying to protect our clients. You have to look out for yourself, because this license is your livelihood. And any of these issues where we run into where someone starts to say you're to blame, not only does it cause us money, but it puts us in a position where, the Department of Real Estate could, restrict our license or even take it away if they think that we did something negligent. Okay. Okay. Investigation of property. Anybody have any questions about the investigation? So that covers everything: professional home inspection, any other due diligence that you need to do as buyer. It does not include reviewing the disclosures or documents that are going to be provided by the seller. Okay, let's see. Can we have them choose the company in writing, book the appointment for them, and then pay directly to the company? Well, I mean, they're always going to have to pay directly to the company because they should be there for their home inspection. That should be. I mean, that should be a given that the buyer should be there. I think you guys should be there too. I know that there's something like, hey, I got to go prospect. I got to do things. I think sometimes it's. It's my opinion. And it's a business decision for everybody. But you and the buyer should be there, at very least the buyer, but you should be there with them. I mean, you never know what's going to happen, and you don't want to get your buyer scared. So you got to be there to kind of guide them. Yeah, I mean, if you have an email from your buyer that says, yes, this is the company I've chosen I want to use, can you book the appointment for me? As long as you have something that shows that they were actively asking you to make that booking, that's cool, because now they're saying, I hired the company. I've chosen that company. Okay. Again, I would still, if you want to do that to kind of help with your scheduling, good. As long as there's proof that you offered them choices and that they said, this is the choice I've made, can you go ahead and schedule it? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And yeah, please don't have your TC schedule your home inspection. Don't ask them to do that. That's not their job. And again, you're now putting liability back on yourself because your TC is an extension of you. Okay. Same thing with the termite. I mean, we don't do termite a lot, but when we do, you guys shouldn't be, the agent shouldn't be the one that's signing off on the work order and approving the work order. That needs to be something that the buyer does. And you should be doing the same thing. If your buyer wants to do a termite inspection, you shouldn't be choosing and scheduling the appointment. Do the same thing as you would with your home inspection. Okay. All right. Investigation of property. That's that. Next, informational access to the property. So in the contract, even let's say I've removed all my contingencies, I still have informational access to the property. And it says right in here, buyer's right to access property for informational purposes is not a contingency. So if I remove all my contingencies, I'm not removing this. It does not create cancellation rights and applies even if contingencies are removed. So what happens is they're basically saying, look, and this is probably more towards investors, right? Where investors go, yeah, we got a 7-day or a 14-day escrow, whatever it is. And we just want to get in and take a look at the place, but we're not doing a true physical inspection. We don't, that's not what we just want to get a look at the property. If the buyers removed all their contingencies, you still cannot deny them access to the property. And same goes for a buyer's agent. Let's say, for example, I have a traditional buyer that did a shorter investigation period and a shorter appraisal period, and we didn't address this informational access to the property, right? That amount of time. If they remove their appraisal in 10 days and their home inspection in 7, and they still want to go back after they've removed their contingencies, if we didn't change this informational access to property amount of time, we can't deny them the right to go back in. And I think what happens is because I hear these conversations all the time, where agents are saying, well, the buyer's asking you to do this and the seller doesn't want to let them in. We as listing agents have got to start having conversations with our sellers that they understand that, hey, for this amount of time that's going to happen in 3L3, this informational access to property, we cannot deny them access. Now, it has to be reasonable, obviously. They can't just be like, hey, we're coming tomorrow night at 9:30 and we have to be okay with it. No, it's got to be reasonable, and that's fine. But you can't just say, no, period, you can't come in. You could, let's say, hey, they want requests to go check out the property. Okay, let's look at a time that works. You have to be flexible and open to the idea that these people are going to have access to your property. You can't tell them no. And especially during their contingency periods when they need to do an appraisal and they need to have their home inspector come out, you got to tell your sellers to be in a place where they're flexible and allowing those things to happen, because it's not fair to say you have this amount of time to do it, but we're only going to let you do it, a week from today, which is, the second to the last day of your contingency period. And that happens a lot. It happens more than you would probably guess that it happens. And there's probably people on here that it's happened to in the past where somebody said, no, you can't have access. And they give you very little time to review things and do what you need to do. So listing agents, it's on you to make sure that happens. So as a listing agent, if all the contingencies have been shortened, I have to make sure that I actually respond to this in the counteroffer and say, hey, informational access to property to be X amount of days. And what I would do is I would make it the same amount as my longest contingency where they need access, right? Whether that be the appraisal or the investigation. Okay. Any questions about informational access or the investigation? Anybody? No? Okay. Next up is the insurance. It's 17 days. Unless you got a really short escrow and I'm seller, I would leave it alone, right? Like, would allow you to have the 17 days. We know what the issues are with people trying to obtain insurance right now. So let's not try to put a limit on the amount of time they have to be tough. And basically what we're doing is we're looking at just canceling transactions because people are going to have any time. But if you're a buyer's agent, you need to jump on it immediately. That's got to be something that you're not putting off on how the lender will find home insurance, or you got to get your buyers active in finding home insurance. Virginia, you have a question. Go ahead. Well, raise your hand, Virginia, because let me see if I can find you here. There you go. Go ahead and unmute, Virginia.
Kyle, and good morning. Morning. So when I counter offer, I usually put on there, I tighten up all the timelines, right? You do the loan, the appraisal, the inspection. But to make sure that there's nothing else that can come back to haunt us, should we add on there all contingencies to be removed at a certain time?
Well, I mean, if you've got the contingencies already, if you've already addressed them on the amount of time they have for that contingency, you don't. I mean, not all your contingencies should be the exact same time. I mean, I know the default here, they do everything 17 days, but you can manipulate some things. Like I said, like appraisal could be different than investigation. Loan could be a little bit different depending on their pre-qual or pre-approval or whatever it is they sent you for the application. Here's the thing. There are agents.
Okay, go ahead.
There are agents that try to make the contingency removals automatic, right? That just says all contingencies are automatically removed on the date, right, of the contingency period, at the end of the contingency period, without any further written instructions, and that's it, right? Like, your contingency removed. The problem I have with that is that what it does is it basically takes the listing agent out of the transaction, right? Because you're not staying on top of where things are and what's happening, because you're like, well, their contingencies are removed. If they don't perform, then I'm going to keep their deposit. The thing is that we all know that it's not that easy just to keep a buyer's deposit. So even if I put on here that all your contingencies are removed on the date that the contingency period ends without any further written instruction, in order for them to lose their deposit, escrow still need a written instruction for them to sign and release the deposit to me when we cancel. And if they don't do it and we have to go through dispute resolution and it takes a couple months and my seller is upset, my seller's now going to turn on me and say, wait a minute, you told me this was automatic, that if they didn't remove the contingencies and they didn't close, or that if they went past these periods and they didn't close, that we were going to get their deposit, because that's how listing agents sell it. Right? Otherwise, what's the point of having the contingencies automatically removed if you're not selling it to the seller as that's how we're going to get their deposit if they don't close? Doesn't work like that. What would be smarter is, as listing agent, as I say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that 2 days prior to all these periods, whether it's 5 days, 12 days, 17 days, 21 days, whatever it is, that I send that buyer a notice to perform to do that contractual obligation or remove that contingency. And if they don't, then we can cancel and move on. We're not going to keep their deposit, but we won't be in escrow for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens with those automatic contingency removals, is you still get to the close of escrow date and you're like, well, their contingencies were removed. If they don't close, we're going to keep it. Well, why did you let it get that far? You could have canceled this deal 2 weeks ago. So I think it's just more about staying on top of that contingency period, more than that there's something that you can write that makes them take action.
I guess I just want to make sure that they don't have a loophole of being able to, extend that time period. So like you mentioned, right, the informational access to property. If we don't counter some of these, then there's a chance that they can request an extension.
On all of them, they can request an extension. Requesting an extension, you can't take away. I mean, you could, I guess, try to say no extensions will be granted, but it doesn't stop them from requesting it. Here's the thing. This is where the listing agents, and I say this, they get lazy, is they don't pay attention to the time periods, right? So for example, this investigation of property that we have there, that we've changed it to 5 days, right? If they don't remove their contingency in writing after day 5, then that contingency still keeps going. If I don't take the initiative to send them a notice to perform in order for them to remove it, it's my fault that contingency continues through. And again, because listing agents don't understand the contract as well as they should, they don't have that conversation with their sellers. So when the deal cancels and they haven't had these people remove these contingencies, the seller is upset. Yeah. And then the buyer and the listing agent is at fault for that seller being upset. So it's more just about you guys as listing agents being super proactive to make sure that there is no loophole.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, with the insurance, let's make sure that that we're giving them ample time to get the insurance, because we know it's difficult. And that's a conversation for listing agents to have with their sellers, to let them know, hey, look, with this insurance thing, we're going to give them some leeway on it because it is difficult to get insured. And every buyer that we're going to work with is going to need some kind of insurance, because the 99% of them are getting financing, right? So keep that in mind. The review of sellers' documents. Again, all of these are 17 days. What we have to look at is, what is my close of escrow period? So if I've shortened my close of escrow, it's on me to shorten this amount of time for reviewing the documents. If I have a 30-day plus escrow, then 17 days is fine. Unless I start getting into something really long, like 60 days or 90-day escrows, then I have some of these contingencies I could extend, like things like appraisal and loan contingency, because if I get the appraisal done and remove my appraisal contingency in 17 days, but we don't close escrow for 60 days, or I remove my loan contingency in 17 days, even if I have full loan approval, it's only good for 30 days. So if you get these longer escrows, you've got to then address it the opposite direction too. And that's something that we didn't talk about last week or in the earlier conversations. But review of sellers' documents. So people look at this 17 days on the review of sellers' documents, right? And they think, okay, so it's the seller has 7 days, and we can look at that if you look down a little bit farther on 3N1. Seller has 7 days to deliver all of the documents, whatever that is. That's disclosures, that's any reports that they may have had from previous escrows, all that stuff. That's 7 days. And then there's 10 days for the buyer to investigate those, to review those. That's not really how the math works, though, right? So agents used to assume, buyers agents used to assume that if I got my my documents later than 7 days. I just had 10 days from that point, and that's not the truth. The way that the time periods work, and we'll talk about it, later on when we're into the description paragraphs, is my contingency period is still going to be 17 days on the review of seller's documents, as long as the seller is not late on the delivery of their documents. And even if the seller is late, it is still 5 days after the delivery or my original contingency, whichever is greater. Okay. So, for example, if review of seller's documents, our contingency period, we've left it at 17 days. Let's just say we've left it at 17. It hasn't been shortened. A lot of times those get shortened. So it hasn't been shortened 17 days. If the seller were to deliver me all the documents required in the contract that they're required to give me, if they deliver all of those between day 1 and day 12 after acceptance, I would still have to remove my contingency of review of seller's documents on day 17. Let that sink in for a second. Because remember, it's 5 days after delivery or your original contingency period, whichever is greater. Okay? So anytime between day 7 and day 12 that they deliver me the disclosures and all the documents, I would still have to remove my contingency on day 17. Once they get past they're day 13, 14, right? They're 2 weeks into giving me the documents that they need. Then it's the 5 days, solely the 5 days, right? So it continues moving out 5 days, 5 days. And if you're getting the documents delivered to you piecemeal, it's not from the first one that was delivered, it's from the last one that was delivered. So let's say they gave you, there's 7 or 8 documents that are required. They give you 5 of them on day 7, but they give you the last 3 on day 15. Your contingency period starts on that 5 days starts on day 15 on where you'd have to remove that contingency. So as listing agent, you got to be prepared for that too. Like, hey, we got to make sure if there's documents that are required to deliver. And when we get into the seller's delivery of documents in the detailed paragraphs, it'll tell you what paragraphs to look at for what documents are required to be delivered. Okay. But we'll get to that later. So if I'm listing agent, what does that mean? Anything I'm required to deliver, whether that be a pre-sale inspection from the city, prelim, past home inspection, all the disclosures that I'm required to deliver, anything that I'm required to deliver to the buyer, I should have it ready prior to even opening escrow with a buyer. So that way I don't ever have to worry about being late with the delivery. The issue where listing agents run into is that they wait to do disclosures and order reports and do all these things after they get an offer accepted, that's where it leads to issues where buyers then get to extend their contingency periods because of the actions of a listing agent. So please keep in mind how that works with your delivery of documents and what the effect of the contingency period is. Here's the flip side. If I'm the buyer's agent that's done a shorter escrow and I'm now trying to make my offer look more attractive and I shorten all of my contingency periods, and let's say I make everything on here 10 days, right? Because I've seen that too, where they just blanket say all my contingencies are 10 days. Well, now my review of seller's documents is 10 days, but then I don't address the seller's delivery of documents. Now, remember what the contract says is if the seller is late, the 5 days go into effect. If I have a 10-day review of seller's documents and I haven't changed in 3N1 where it says seller has 7 days to deliver the documents to me, if the seller were to deliver all of their documents prior to day 7, I would still have to remove my contingency on day 10, even though what that means is I only have maybe 3-4 days max to be able to review. Okay. Now, if they were late, if they came day 8, day 9, and I had a 10-day review, then I'd get those 5 days. So again, just as us looking at our contingency periods, like when we shorten them, if we're the ones that shorten them, then we should address everything that affects that time period. So if I'm going to shorten my review of seller's documents to 10 days, then I should review I should reduce the delivery of the seller's documents to 5 days, so that I still have that 5-day cushion. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about that? Because I know that math sometimes gets confusing with the 5 days and whether they're late or they're not. Does anybody have any questions or need any clarification on that before we move forward? All right, I guess not. Good. The preliminary title report, again, 17 days, right? That's fine. Again, if I'm the listing agent, I should already have that prelim prior to getting an offer accepted. If my title company won't provide the title until there's an offer accepted, that's fine, but that should be one of the first things that gets ordered. And if you're using the TCs, it generally is, if they know what title company you're using. The common interest disclosures, that's a little different because that's the HOA stuff, right? So the HOA stuff, generally you don't get a copy of those HOA documents until you open escrow, and then escrow will order them because you need to pay for them to come in. So escrow waits for HOA, those disclosures, those common disclosures usually come a little bit later because escrow has to wait for some money to come in. Those aren't considered part of the seller's documents because they come from a third party, basically. So, but as listing agent, give them the time. Like, don't shorten that one because we're not in control of that. Right. So give them a little time, just like we were talking about the insurance. Okay. The review of leased or liened items. Again, if I'm a listing agent that knows that there are solar panels that the seller is not going to pay off, and those are things that need to be, taken over by the buyer, then I should have all of the documents necessary to deliver to them so that contingency runs in line with the review of seller's documents and all the others. Okay. We've got to provide them the information necessary for them to be able to negotiate the assumption of those leased or liened items. Now, if I know as listing agent that the financing company that's dealing with those leased or liened items will not allow them to be assumed, then that's a conversation that I have to have with the seller on. If you want to sell your house, you're going to have to pay these off, or we're going to have to get a buyer that's willing to pay them off, and that's going to make things difficult. I don't think there's a lot of those companies that finance those items that don't allow them to be assumed. But remember, it is a contingency for the buyer. And if they can't get that assumption, you can't force them to move forward, right? If they can't now take over that lease or lien, you can't force them to move forward, as long as they get the information done in the time that's required, and that you also provided them the documents that were necessary for them to negotiate that transfer. Okay. 3L9 is sale of buyer's property. So you only have to check that if the buy this offer is contingent on the buyer selling their property to buy this one. We'll do a specific class on contingent sales just because it's a lot of detail in there. But if that were the case, they would check this box, and then there would be a form COP that would be added to your transaction, and you would have to send that COP with your offer, which then puts the contingency in place of saying, if I can't sell my house, I can't buy your house, is basically what it is. Okay. All right. Questions on anything in paragraph 3L before I move on? Okay, good. All right. 3M, this is possession. This is when we're going to be the owners, when we're going to occupy. So 3M1 is time of possession. Possession is ownership, not moving in, just when I own it. That's what possession means. Okay. Not occupancy. Possession. I own it. Now, it could be the same, right? If the property is vacant, my time of possession is also the time I'm going to be the occupant. The majority of the properties that we sell here are usually seller occupied, right? That's what we're dealing with. It's not always a vacant home, right? So time of possession, you can leave it alone upon notice of recordation. So that means as soon as you get that confirmation that the property recorded, you are the owner. Okay. And that goes back to the walkthrough that we talked about, is doing that walkthrough 5 days prior, because once it records, it's yours. And if anything happens in that period of time, that's your responsibility if you can't show that the property was damaged prior to. Okay. I don't know that you would change that possession right? The time, unless you had to. So what are those boxes for? Well, they are for you to be able to change it to a specific time that you're taking possession of the property. But we're talking about here being the owner and being the occupant are two different things. Okay. So I don't know what the effect is of tenant occupied properties for you taking possession. You're still going to be the owner when the property records. This, we're going to talk about the possession of these things. They're addressed differently on different documents. Okay. So possession, you can leave that alone. The seller occupied units, this is what we're going to talk about now about when the seller's going to have, how long the seller's going to remain in possession after the close of escrow. So if we look at here, close of escrow date, if we don't check anything off, this and this are the same thing, right? The time of possession, the time of occupancy, same thing. But if the seller is in possession, we're going through that right now, Abel. So if the seller is in possession of the property, is going to remain in possession after the close of escrow. And it's something that you guys as buyer's agents should do automatically. It still amazes me that when I look at offers, a buyer's agent writes an offer that says that close of escrow date, we're getting the delivery of the occupancy. And I asked the question, is there a seller there? Is the property vacant? Oh no, the seller lives there. Then add at least 3 days, right? Then the next question is this contingent on them finding a replacement property? Yes. Okay. Then at a very minimum, add 7. You're better to add 10 days for the seller to remain in possession. Okay. So it all is going to depend on the type of transaction. Now, if the property is vacant, don't sweat it. You could leave this alone. But if there is a seller living in the property, at a very minimum, you've got to give them 3 days after close of escrow. If it is contingent on them finding a replacement property, I would suggest you do 10 days because they're going to need to, you're going to fund and record. Then they need to fund and record on their loan. And then maybe even the up leg has to fund and record, right? You're talking about days and days and days. So at a minimum, 10 days after close of escrow, and make sure your buyer is aware that it could extend past that. Okay. So if it's anything less than 29, if it's 29 days or less or fewer, 29 days or fewer, then we would use the form SIP. So if you check this box, for example, and say, okay, we're going to give them 14 days after close of escrow, then it's going to attach the seller's license to remain in possession. Okay. And that is this one. And what this is it's negotiating the terms of the seller remaining in possession for those 14 days. And we're going to do that 14 days here. Now, because we're still in a seller's market, if you're going to give them these days, whether it's the 3, the 7, the 10, the 14, whatever it is, if you want to have strength of offer, you don't charge them anything for that time period. Okay. You let them stay there for free. If we're going to do anything else besides that, like to make sure that we're covered, we may want to put in here that the seller agrees to a per diem, of, let's just say $100 right now. If seller remains in possession beyond day 14 after. So what I've done by adding this in to my SIP is I said, okay, 14 days, you guys have it, live there for free. I'm cool with that. I understand what you're going through. But if you have to remain past day 14, you're going to then pay me $100 a day for all the days that you remain. Okay. So I'm only doing this on SIPs because I know that these people are generally going to move out. This is like, for example, this one is their contingent on finding a replacement property. If this is just, I need 29 days, then I'm going to put the limit, right? So like, or if I need 14 days, Just I need 14 days. It's not contingent. And I say, okay, I'll give you 14 days for free. I would put in here 14 days after close of escrow, not to exceed 29 days. The problem is, and I still have to have this conversation with my buyers, is that if they stay past the 29 days, there's nothing I could do about it. I can't evict them, or I could start the eviction process, but it's going to take a while. So we still have to be prepared that that happens. There's nothing we can do to guarantee that they're going to be out the day they set it. So we still have to prepare our buyers, but it's still a necessity for us to have these things in place when we're closing escrow. Okay, Jesus, go ahead.
Good things, Kyle. I remember years ago we would always say $100 per diem, but
I'm just throwing out a number. I'm sure it's much higher now. It's all going to be it's all dependent on what the buyer's paying. I just threw out a number.
Thank you.
But you're probably looking at 175, 200, 250. It's depending on the buyer's payment.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here I'm just throwing out a number, but
thank you.
Look, and here's the other thing to understand as a listing agent, and this is why I like to talk about these per diems, is because this is really more of a benefit to the seller than it is to the buyer.
100%.
Because as seller, now I know that my only obligation, should I somehow breach this contract, is to pay that amount of money for those days. So if I stay a week later, and let's say it's $200, I know that the limit of my exposure is $1,400, right? Because I stayed 7 days. If I stay 7 days and don't have any of this in place, if the buyer can prove that they had damages that were $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, if they can prove that, and they can take me to civil court for that, they could win that money as damages. So what this does is it protects the seller. And for us as listing agents, we have to understand how that protection works, because that's how we sell the why they need to agree to this kind of a term, and why as listing agents, we need to put it in if the buyer's agent didn't, because we're protecting our seller. Now, the benefit to the buyer is I don't have to prove any damage. Even if it might be less than what I would need to cover my principal, interest, and insurance on my payments, even if it's a little bit less, at least I know I'm getting something without having to go to court and prove that they owe me something for those damages. So you can see there's a benefit to both sides with having that per diem in place.
100%.
Yes.
And what I do, I usually talk to the listing agent and I tell them that I'm going to add those per diems with an amount, so it's not a surprise to them.
Yeah.
To him or her. First of all. Second of all, I also talk to the agent and let him know that I'm going to write escrow to hold $5,000 from seller's proceeds, just to make sure they leave. I mean, they leave some money on the table.
Yeah, and now I'm going to show you guys that there's a section for that. It's called the delivery of possession fee. It's right here. Now you have to be careful, because if let's say, for example, in Jesus's example, he puts 5,000. If you don't check this box right here, the 5,000 gets released to the buyer. And then the buyer has 5 days after the delivery to return that money to the seller. So again, you have to make sure as listing agent, your conversations are with the seller that, hey, you're not getting this money the day you move out. Even if it's held in escrow, you're going to get it 5 days after the delivery of the possession to the buyer. Because we've had arguments in the past with where agents are saying, no, I want my money. And the outside agent is saying, no, you don't get it. It's 5 days. We have 5 days to get that released to you from escrow. And our agents aren't paying attention. And then we have to have the conversation with them and say, well, look at what it says here. Right. So have that conversation. That delivery of possession fee is important, that it's there. It's not ever money that the buyer gets to keep. Keep that in mind. They don't get to keep that money if the seller doesn't move out. The money just gets held until the seller moves out. So you may want to look at it at a different amount to make it more of an incentive to get them out. Make it hurt a little bit if they need that money.
10 grand.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's the seller to license remain in possession. You have to have that if they're going to be 29 days or fewer in possession of the property. If it is going to be 30 days or more, It's a little bit more complicated. And what then gets added is the residential lease after sale. And you can look at it. This is a lease agreement. We're not going to go through this because it gets really detailed right now. The seller license is different for us to kind of run through quickly. This is a lease. So you've got to go through and figure out all the terms of the lease, when the payments are going to get made, how they're going to get made, if they're going to get made, right? If you're charging them for those 30 days, how much is their security deposit? What are they responsible for? Who's paying the utilities, all that stuff. So if you can avoid 30 days plus, it's a lot simpler negotiation. But if it does exceed that 29 days that we just talked about, right? So if it does exceed 29 days, you have to include the RLAS. Okay. All right. So let's finish there for today because it's already 11:54. And I'll give you guys a moment to ask some questions. Okay. So let's see in the chat. Let's see. Is there a formula used to prevent that? Excuse me. I'm not quite sure what I mean. Formula, the 45 days. That's just negotiating on whether the seller needs all 45 days. If you're willing to give them, if you have the luxury to give them the 45 days as buyer. I mean, that starts to get a little bit. It starts to get a little bit difficult too, because with buyers with financing with, FHA, even with conventionals, they expect them to be in possession in 60 days. And if you're getting close to that 60-day period, it makes people a little bit nervous about that financing. But there's no formula. It's just negotiating, what your buyer is willing to do and what the seller is willing to accept. Anyone else with any questions? No. All right. So let's see. What do we have left? We got I'm going to try to get this done in the next 2 weeks. So next week and the week after, and we should be done with the RPA because I want to move on to some other stuff. So, I'm going to try to get through it quickly in the next 2 weeks so that we can move on. Yes, Jesus, go ahead.
On the TOPA, is it necessary? Is it like a home inspection or a thermal inspection? If we write, do we need that to close an escrow? We don't, right? I should have finished with that instead of the other two, but we'll start with that next week. But the TOPA is required whether the tenants are moving out or not. What about the tenants don't want to sign it?
Tenants don't sign that. The TOPA is only signed by the buyers and the sellers. There's a form that comes up with it called the rent cap. That's just an advisory. That's not anything that needs to be signed for the transaction. You can toss that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about that. The only thing that would be signed by the tenants is if there's tenant estoppels, and we'll talk about that next week when we get into the TOPA, because there's a request for tenant estoppels in there. So that would need to be signed by the tenants. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Thank you guys so much for being here. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning that we were having. Remember, this will be on YouTube later today if you missed any part of it, or if you want to go back to review. Please like, subscribe, share it. Let everybody know that it's there, and hopefully they'll do the same and come, and then you will be dealing with the same level of professionalism that you guys are out there providing and dealing with your clients and other agents. So like I said, I appreciate you guys being here and listening to me. Thank you so much, and I will see you again soon. Take care.